In February 1988, 29-year-old carpenter John Duffy was on trial for rape and the murder of 3 women. He was one half of a terrifying duo who'd become infamous across London. The newspapers had dubbed them the Railway Killers.
As one victim later said, they were like 2 bodies with 1 brain. They knew exactly what the other one was going to do. Their bond was unique and wicked.
After receiving 6 life sentences, Duffy still refused to give up the name of his accomplice, a 29-year-old father of 4 named David Mulai.
I think Mulai is somebody who returns to a normal life and has absolutely no problem in doing that. He doesn't feel bad about what he's done, and it's very much about self-preservation for him.
But over a decade later, Mulai was still free, and Duffy had had enough. He finally confessed to all his crimes and told investigators he would testify against his former friend.
It was almost as if he considered this was an act of betrayal of what was a unique and wicked bond for decades. These were so poles apart now across the courtroom.
John Duffy and David Mulai had made their mark as 2 of the world's most evil killers. Two rapists struck fear into the hearts of women across London. When John Duffy was arrested in November 1986, it brought an end to an horrific 4-year crime spree across the British capital. But it would be another 15 years before Duffy's accomplice, David Mulai, was found guilty for his part in the heinous crimes. Between them, the deadly duo were responsible for over 20 rapes and 3 murders. It was Duffy's testimony at Mulcahy's trial in the year 2000 that helped to incarcerate his one-time friend.
As the judge delivered the sentence, Mulcahy gave no reaction, staring straight ahead. The judge told him these were sadistic killings, and of the 2 of you, I have no doubt it was you who derived gratification from the act of killing.
One of the lead detectives charged with catching the so-called railway killers was Charlie Farquhar. His son Simon remembers the case well.
These women had their lives disfigured by these 2 men. 3 women lost their lives to these 2 men. Nothing can ever atone for that, and it's a pretty grim thing to immerse yourself in for a period of time.
Over 30 years after the murders, Simon has penned a book about the hunt and capture of Duffy and Mulcahy.
Once I started to really delve into it and really investigate it, I realised I was completely unprepared for just how horrific a case like this actually is. Unlike police officers who have all kinds of defences built up over years and years to deal with these sort of things, I did wander into this as a bit of an innocent, and it does still really haunt me.
The story of these 2 killers begins half a century ago. John Duffy was born in 1958 and David Mulcahy in 1959 on separate sides of the Irish Sea.
Well, both Duffy and Mulcahy are from Catholic families, Irish Catholic families. Duffy was actually born in the Republic of Ireland and came over to England with his family when his father was looking for work. Mulcahy was born in England, and he was the son of a man who went on to become a pub landlord.
In 1970, the 2 11-year-old boys struck up a friendship while attending Haverstock School in North London.
I think that Duffy and Mulcahy came together for a variety of different reasons. They were both from Irish families, and the Irish community were still suffering quite a lot of discrimination at this point in time in British society. Also, there was a sense in which they could be a partnership, because Duffy, he was quite short, he had red hair, he was bullied at school, but Mulcahy was bigger, he was broader, and he could be his protector, essentially. So it was quite a brotherhood, really, rather than any kind of casual friendship, and it was them against the rest of the world.
By the age of 13, both boys were already displaying signs of disturbing behaviour.
Well, Mulcahy was suspended from school after he and Duffy were found essentially playing a version of cricket, but using a live hedgehog. And they were found after they'd been engaging in this, and Duffy was covered in blood, and he was laughing at Mulcahy, who was also covered in blood. So this really is quite a warning signal. It's basically a complete lack of empathy for the feelings of this living creature that they were tormenting. And they're starting to experiment here. Their behaviour is starting to escalate, and it really is quite a significant red flag.
They became fascinated with each other's company. They would haunt Hampstead Heath wearing Halloween masks and jump out and frighten courting couples who used to meet on Hampstead Heath, terrify them, and they took enormous pleasure from it.
So these two, they're really having the time of their lives doing this. They're really enjoying having that power over others. But I think to come across them out there in the park in the dark would have been really, really frightening.
As the two teenagers became young men, Duffy and Mulcahy's scare tactics took a criminal turn.
So in their case, you started with the pranks. It moved on to burglary and car theft. They stole the cars again. They didn't steal the car because they wanted to sell the car. It wasn't for profit. They stole the car because they wanted to drive around and they wanted to have fun.
But then we see that escalate. We see their physical violence angle kind of start to come out a little bit more. So we hear stories of them shooting at people in the street with an air pistol.
The pair found work at Westminster City Council, Duffy as a carpenter and Mulcahy as a plumber. On one job, Mulcahy had spotted a woman who he thought needed to be taught a lesson. He and Duffy went to her house after dark, intent on raping the woman.
So Duffy and Mulcahy break into the house and lay in wait for the woman whose house Mulcahy's been decorating. But the woman, thankfully, doesn't come home that night. She's gone to a friend's. This infuriates both Duffy and Mulcahy.
So you've got a plan developing here. They're starting to actually decide, well, this is what we're going to do. This isn't something that's opportunistic. This is something that's very much premeditated.
Duffy and Mulcahy were undeterred. They tried the same plan again with a different woman, but escaped from her house when she returned home with a man.
And they probably talk about, say, look, the thing about breaking into people's house and waiting for them is no good because we don't know if they're gonna come back. We don't know if they're gonna come back with somebody else. So instead of that, how about we actually drive around, find someone, see someone on the street, and then we pounce on them on a dark alley or something like that. So I think the rush that they got from breaking into the house just motivate them to go and do the real thing.
By 1980, both men were in their early 20s and married, but their lust for rape remained. 2 years later, they were ready to strike.
In October 1982, they found the first one. 21-year-old girl coming back from a party carrying a teddy bear. They put a knife to her throat and forced her into a garden of an empty house. They said, I think it was Duffy who said, "Don't worry, we only want the teddy bear." Nothing could have been further from the truth. They stripped the girl, gagged her, blindfolded her, and raped her.
From then on, the attacks became incredibly prolific. At one point, there was 3 in one night. They would generally drive around together, listening to music to psych themselves up. They carried with them a kit of balaclavas or masks. Mulcahy would put gaffer tape inside his jacket, which would then be used to gag the victims. He'd often blindfold them as well.
Paul Cheston from the Evening Standard newspaper recalls the fear felt across the capital.
That added to the sense of terror felt by Londoners that it was almost a military-style operation, and the planning that was going into it was much more than just spur of attack, moment attacks.
Mulcahy would always ask the victims their names and addresses as well, and would often steal items which had their address on, library cards, that sort of thing. The idea was that if these victims went to the police, we will find you, and so on. They always made sure their victims were reduced to a state of abject terror.
One such attack occurred in the summer of 1984.
The attack on the two Danish au pairs took place in July 1984. That night, Duffy and Mulcahy had been driving around for a long time, unable to find a victim. And finally, they saw these two 18-year-old girls walking along Spaniards Road on the edge of Hampstead Heath. They'd been out in the West End and missed the last train home and were walking back. They decided to attack them both. Duffy had a replica gun, and Mulcahy had a knife. They were dragged off the road and onto the heath and brutally assaulted.
For 3 years, Duffy and Mulcahy continued undetected.
In late 1985, the police had connected 24 attacks on women in North London, and posters went up across London for the North London rapists. They knew they were looking for two men, a shorter man and a taller one. They didn't know a great deal about the taller man, but they knew that the shorter man was an A-secretor blood group, had fair hair. The taller man they knew a lot less about. He had a darker complexion, he had a mole on his chin, he had mousy brown hair and was about 5'11" tall and was much more violent than the shorter man.
The majority of the attacks had taken place in the vicinity of train stations. The press had dubbed them the railway rapists.
It was a very big story in London. There was a widespread concern, not just because rapists were loose, but because they were finding victims in and around railway stations. And London has millions of Londoners travel on public transport, and it was a serious concern for Londoners.
But it was about to get worse. Their next victim would not just be raped, she would be murdered. By December 1985, John Duffy and David Mulcahy had been sexually assaulting women in and around railway stations in London for over 3 years. Still undetected by the police, their confidence was growing.
I think it was inevitable that this was only going to escalate further because we've got two men here who are really enjoying the sexual violence that they've been perpetrating. And often when you look at offenders who are engaged in this kind of behaviour, they're not going to just stop at a particular level. They want to keep upping the ante. So I think murder was unfortunately inevitable here.
On December the 29th, 1985, Alison Day caught a train to Hackney Wick Station to meet her fiancé.
Alison Day was a 19-year-old secretary who lived in Upminster with her parents. She'd been adopted as a baby and brought into a very, very loving household. She worked as a secretary in a local solicitor's office. She was enormously bubbly and popular, and she just got engaged.
But Alison never completed her journey.
At that time, obviously, it was a torture for her parents, not knowing if she'd just run away, although it seemed absolutely implausible that she had. What had actually happened was that she'd got the train to Hackney Wick and Duffy and Mulcahy were waiting for her on the platform. They could quite easily have walked her out of the station, but instead they decided to walk her across the live rail tracks, down the railway siding, and then under the railway bridge. There they both committed horrific attacks on her. And at this point, as far as Duffy was aware, the plan was to leave Alison on the far side of the bridge and then make their escape. But Mulcahy wanted to do something more than that, so he made her walk along the outside ledge of the bridge. She couldn't swim. It was also at 1 degree below freezing, and she fell into the River Lee, screaming out that she couldn't swim. She waded to the edge and Duffy helped her out, and then she managed to run. She ran for her life, and this enraged Mulcahy. And Mulcahy yelled out, "Get the bitch, John, get her."
Duffy caught up with Alison, but Mulcahy's slip of the tongue had sealed her fate.
He said to Duffy, "We have to do this because she's seen us and she knows your name now."
He cuts up the blouse she's wearing and uses it to strangle her. And he says to Duffy, "You turn the tourniquet one more time just so that we're in it together."
Alison was begging and pleading for her life, and her last words were, "Please, it's only the moustache I've seen. I won't tell anyone. Do not hurt me." Just unbelievable. She was strangled, rolled into the river, and then they both drove back. Duffy was panicking. Mulcahy said, "We would have been done for attempted murder anyway. It's got to be, that's just the way it is." He dropped Duffy off. Mulcahy picked his children up, went back home, and Alison Day was dead.
The 19-year-old's body was found 3 weeks later, face down in a canal. The railway rapists had become the railway killers. Duffy and Mulcahy had strangled Alison to death using a tourniquet.
I think when we're looking at the murder of Alison Day and we hear about them twisting the tourniquet together, basically what they're doing here is saying, we're in this together, we've both done this, you can't blame it on me, I can't blame it on you. So there is that pact going back to their school days when they said they're not going to grass on each other. That really is the kind of cementing of that.
Less than 6 months later, Duffy and Mulcahy struck again. This time their victim was even younger.
Marty Tamboza was a Dutch schoolgirl. She just celebrated her 15th birthday. On Thursday the 17th of April, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after coming home from school, she had something to eat, had a drink, and then got on her bike to cycle into the village to buy some sweets from the shop. Her mum said to her, as she always did, don't take the railway path because it's very quiet along there, take the long way round. Marty, being a teenage girl, thought it'll be all right, and she took the railway path, and Duffy and Mulcahy were waiting at the end of it for her.
Marcher was raped by both men in the woods near Horsley Station. Mulcahy used a rock to knock the 15-year-old schoolgirl unconscious, and then made the decision that she had to die.
He then instructs Duffy that he has to kill her. After all, I killed the first one, you've got to kill the second one. They take her belt, put it round her neck, and they stick a stick through the belt to tighten the pressure on her neck. And they do indeed kill the poor 15-year-old. Innocent, had done nothing more than ride her bicycle, and she'd done nothing to these two men. It was an absolutely abhorrent, depraved, disgraceful crime.
Once Duffy had killed Marty Tamboza, Mulcahy ran up to him and said, well done, you've done good. And almost like he was the captain of a football team, congratulating a new player. He then told Duffy to go back to the station and said he would see him there. He said he wanted to go back to the body to make sure there were no fingerprints left on the rock. He actually went back to make sure that she was dead and to make a pretty vile attempt to destroy any forensic evidence there was by setting fire to her.
Marcher's body was found in the woods the following day.
The sight that greeted those police officers was absolutely horrific. She'd been savagely raped, submitted to brutal head injuries, strangled, and the body had been set on fire in a clear attempt to destroy forensic evidence. She was lying beside some bluebells, and the police christened the inquiry Operation Bluebell in tribute to her.
Metropolitan Police Detective Charlie Farquhar, who was investigating the murder of Alison Day, contacted his colleagues in Surrey Police. He believed the two murders were connected.
And when he told Surrey on the phone, Surrey realised that the piece of wood that was lying next to Marty's body wasn't in fact just a piece of wood on the ground. It had actually fallen out of the knots in the rope and obviously was the same murder method. And at that point, this became a joint murder inquiry. Shortly afterwards, the connection was made with the London rapes, and this went from being a small inquiry being run from a porter cabin to the biggest criminal manhunt since the search for the Yorkshire Ripper.
Duffy and Mulcahy didn't wait long to claim their third victim. On May the 18th, 1986, recently married Anne Locke boarded a train for Brookman's Park Station in Hertfordshire, but she never made it home.
Anne Locke was 29 years old. She was a bright, attractive girl with a huge amount of talent and future in broadcasting. She was a secretary at London Weekend Television, and she was in love. She'd been married just 4 weeks earlier, had returned from a dream honeymoon in the Seychelles, where she'd gone scuba diving. She still had a suntan from that lovely holiday, and she disappeared.
Paul Dockley from Hertfordshire Police led the inquiry into Anne's disappearance.
The weirdest thing was that the initial officers attending this missing person inquiry discovered that her bike was missing, and in fact we found it behind the shed, leant up against a tree, which was unusual to say the least. And so we started searching. We started searching around the railway station. We also did a trawl of people that may have been on the train coming out of London on that particular night.
It was the latest twist in a story that had captivated the British public.
The disappearance of Anne Locke was a media sensation that summer, the missing bride story as it was called.
And the headlines about missing bride escalated. The speculation became more frenzied about what could have happened to her. They were already piecing her disappearance to the two previous murders. And there was a tangible air of, what are the police doing? They cannot even find a body, let alone find the people responsible.
But the police had little to go on. They could not even be sure that Anne had reached Brookman's Park station.
The first time that the police genuinely realised that Anne was probably dead was when Inspector Paul Dockley was searching the area. And even though the search was massive, the search was generally at ground level. And being a good detective, he looked up, and up in the trees, cradled in the branches, was Anne's diary.
I didn't know it was Anne's diary immediately, but I saw it in the tree, so we recovered that. And within the next day, we reasserted our search in that area and recovered her purse, her LWT pass, and her address book. So at that point, which was probably 4 weeks into the inquiry, we knew at that point that Anne had returned to Brookman's Park.
And just a week later, the police found out the devastating truth of what had happened to 29-year-old Anne.
Eventually, after 9 weeks, the search was called off. The police had gone to the edge of the Hertfordshire boundary and still couldn't find anything. And then a few days later, some railway workers found her body just into the Metropolitan Police District, dreadfully decomposed.
Following the discovery of Anne Locke's body, we actually developed a joint investigation with Hertfordshire, the Met, Surrey and British Transport Police. Investigating a murder is almost like starting a jigsaw puzzle with a piece of blue sky, because you do not know the pattern of how things have occurred. You're faced with a scene, but it doesn't actually tell you necessarily who the offender is. So you're working through that jigsaw of trying to put together all the elements in order to prove a case. And it's hard as a detective to detach yourself from what you actually see. You're dealing with this on a regular basis, but I don't think I've ever come across a case like this.
As one victim later said, they were like two bodies with one brain. They knew exactly what the other one was going to do. If they split up and ran in different directions, they knew where they were going to meet up, and so on. Their bond was unique and wicked.
While police from 3 regions searched for them, Duffy and Mulcahy remained hidden in plain sight, married men with regular jobs. But the net was closing in on the pair. In the summer of 1986, Hertfordshire, Surrey and London's Metropolitan Police forces were working together to try and capture the 2 men the papers were calling the railway killers. But the evidence they had was minimal.
So this was the 1980s. Forensic science was still in its infancy compared to the advances that have been made since. It wasn't just forensic science, which was in quite a primitive state at the time. Also, police treatment of sexual crimes wasn't as sophisticated as understanding as it is now.
The surviving victims had provided investigators with descriptions of their attackers. They knew that one of the rapists was tall and violent, the other short with piercing blue eyes. Forensic evidence suggested that the shorter man had the blood group A.
We were literally going through a list of people that could be possible offenders called the Z-men. And the Z-men had been previously arrested, and you've got to remember this is pre-DNA, so we're the precursor to DNA, and we were looking at A secretors, so people who secreted in their blood or their saliva or semen an A secretor factor.
The Z-Men had over 2,000 people in it. John Duffy was on it because of a serious assault on his wife the previous year. He was number 1,595 on that list. And it was just a case of working through the list and interviewing every single one of those men. Eventually, number 1595 came up and it was time for him to be questioned. He sat down, was quite polite and cooperative, but was behaved rather strangely. He was trying to be much too helpful, and his answers were rather glib. The two police officers interviewing him had an uneasy feeling. They left the room and said to each other, this could be him, not least because of these piercing blue eyes he had, which many of the rape victims had commented on, the shorter man having very piercing blue eyes.
Despite their suspicions, Duffy was released, but before long, he was back.
The two investigators rang me and said, Governor, you won't believe this. He said, last night, John Duffy presented himself at West Hampstead Police Station. He'd been slashed across the chest with a blade, and he was saying that he had amnesia. They took him to his home address. He didn't recognise his mum, his dad, his dog, nothing. And he was taken to Free and Barnet Hospital, where he was sectioned.
The investigation had taken a bizarre twist. Duffy was still a suspect, but the police were not permitted to talk to him while he was sectioned.
So Duffy was at Free and Barnet Hospital, and we weren't allowed to interview him for at least 8 weeks. And unbeknown to us, we thought he was in a secure unit at Free and Barnet Hospital. In actual fact, he was allowed to come and go.
Duffy had been attacking on his own since mid-1984, and unlike Mulcahy, didn't possess the same level of self-control. He was becoming wildly unstable, and he also took a lot more risks when he was carrying out these attacks and was much more careless.
And unfortunately, he went out to a railway line and raped a young girl whilst he was in the care of Free and Barnet Hospital.
The last attack he committed when he knew the police were closing in on him was on a 14-year-old schoolgirl in Watford. And during that attack, her blindfold slipped and she saw him very clearly. When Duffy was arrested, that girl walked into the ID parade and walked straight up and pointed him out. And at that point, that was the end for John Duffy.
He said nothing. He said no comment to everything. He didn't deny anything, he just said no comment. Now, he would talk to me about martial arts as long as the day. You know, he was quite happy to talk about that. But anything to do with rape, missing girls, murders, not interested. And of course, his answer was, I've been in hospital, I've had amnesia. I don't remember anything. I don't remember anything before going into hospital.
Detectives knew they needed some solid evidence if they were going to charge Duffy with murder. And the string that he and Mulcahy had used to tie up Marcia Tambuza 7 months earlier was about to give them just that.
They used a particular piece of string that was called some yarn, and a lot of us will think string is string is string, but when you get down to the forensic detail, how it's made, what it's made of, all of these things can be very different. And if you happen to use a very unusual piece of string, it's going to help identify where that's come from.
And the company said this is a very unusual piece of string because it's been taken from the end of the yarn. So basically it's on a loom and it's cut, and this is an end piece. And they said to us, if you can find the ball of string, we could do a match. So the search team, who went to Duffy's parents' address, searched the outside toilet, and in a bucket in there was a ball of some yarn.
It was enough to finally put an end to the murderous career of one of the railway killers.
Gradually, the evidence is building up against Duffy, and he was charged with the murder of Anne Locke, in addition to the murder of Alison Day, Marcia Tambuza, and a number of rapes.
Investigators were certain that Duffy's accomplice was his oldest friend, David Mulai.
He was actually arrested 4 times over the next few months. Every time that the police got another break, they brought him in again, but eventually realised there just wasn't enough evidence. There was no forensic evidence to connect him with the crimes at all. When they searched his vehicles, they found in the cab of his van masking tape, balaclavas, all sorts of things that incriminated him, but none of it was enough.
But his name was known to the press, and a lot of people, a lot of pressmen went to see him, just to gauge what sort of reaction he would give. Of course, there was no reaction, there was even no comment, and he got increasingly angry about what he called as harassment. But the press knew that there were 2 people involved in the railway rapist cases, and Duffy's friend was the prime suspect.
John Duffy would go to trial alone, and there was more bad news for investigators. The judge instructed the jury to dismiss the murder charge of Anne Locke due to a lack of evidence.
This caused a lot of anguish with Anne Locke's family and a lot of surprise amongst the press. But the problem was that in the Locke case, there was no surviving victim to give any evidence. There were no witnesses to the attack. The fact that the body had been laid unfound for 2 months meant there was no DNA evidence.
In February 1988, John Duffy's trial began at the Old Bailey in London.
John Duffy walked into the witness box at the Old Bailey and put up one of the worst offences ever heard by an Old Bailey jury to suggest that he was suffering from amnesia and could remember nothing about what happened during the period in which he is accused of the murders and rapes was frankly an insult to the intelligence of anyone in court, let alone the jury. His whole body language was of defiance. I am going to give you nothing. I am standing here sticking to my story and I don't care. And the piercing eyes that his victims spoke of, the wild staring blue eyes, absolutely radiated out from the witness box across the court.
Duffy was found guilty of 2 murders and 5 rapes. He was given 6 life sentences, but despite everything, he refused to give up the name of his accomplice and best friend.
Well, maybe the reason why Duffy kept quiet right at the beginning, they had the agreement that they had from a very young age, and they never broke that agreement. We're never going to rat on each other. So when he went to prison, he probably decided, I'm going to stay true because I am, a good friend, or I am the man I am, or whatever. I'm true to my word.
As Duffy's sentence began, David Mulai remained a free man. The married father of 4 set up his own decorating business, and life went on as normal.
I think Mulai is somebody who returns to a normal life and has absolutely no problem in doing that. And that's because he can switch. He can flip very easily because he doesn't feel empathy for his victims. He doesn't feel bad about what he's done. And it's very much about self-preservation for him.
Everybody knew that David Mulai was the second man, but he honestly thought that he got away with that. And for the next 10 years, he pretty much had.
But as Duffy's time in prison passed by, something inside of him clicked. After claiming to be suffering from amnesia, he suddenly got his memory back. By 1999, he was ready to talk and tell the police all about his accomplice, David Mulai. 11 years after his conviction, John Duffy was in prison serving 6 life sentences for his part in a series of rapes and murders in and around London between 1982 and 1986. But Duffy's partner in crime, David Mulai, remained free.
Mulai was the one who first suggested, let's break into the girl's house. He was the one who first suggested, let's go and find victims on the street. And he was the one who first suggested, let's commit murder. But the one who was paying all the price was Duffy. So it's very, very easy for you to see that after 10 years, the little fuse from Duffy got to an end. And he was like, forget it, I'm gonna come and clean.
In 1997, Duffy, who had originally claimed to be suffering from amnesia about the crimes, had begun visiting a prison psychologist.
So basically, Duffy had been in prison for 10 years and thought this is an opportunity to talk and talk and talk. And basically, he told the psychologist about the offences that he had committed and the fact that he hadn't committed them alone.
During their conversations, Duffy reveals that he committed his crimes with another person, and she casually asks which prison his co-defendant is in, and Duffy drops the bombshell. He's not in prison, he was never caught. She says, I have to tell the police about this, which Duffy agrees to. And so she tells the police, John Duffy's just named his accomplice. It's someone called David Mulai.
It was a big breakthrough for detectives who'd been trying to bring Mulai to justice for over a decade. And a huge slice of fortune was about to initiate his downfall.
There's an extraordinary coincidence here. At the same time that this was going on, a similar series of attacks was taking place on Hampstead Heath, and police began to suspect that David Mulcahy may have become active again. They had a DNA profile for the attacker. Mulcahy was brought in, questioned, they took his DNA and it didn't match. And once again, he left the police station, very cocky, very arrogant.
But the police now had Mulcahy's DNA on file. They had to go back 15 years to find a match.
Amazingly, in deep storage was the clothing of the Danish au pairs raped on Hampstead Heath in 1984. And when the clothing was run through forensics, one sample of clothing had Duffy's DNA on it and the other had David Mulcahy's DNA. And suddenly, after all those years of thinking he got away with it, suddenly that case had come back to haunt him.
On February the 6th, 1999, David Mulcahy was taken into custody. He would never be free again.
As soon as I found out that the police had arrested and charged a new suspect in the railway rapist cases, I, like every other pressman who had been in any sort of involvement in the case, immediately knew that it had to be David Mulcahy.
He thought they were just clutching at straws. He thought that this was just another attempt to arrest him, which was going to fall through. When they sat down to question him, the first thing they asked him was about the night of the 15th of July 1984 in the company of John Duffy. And he wasn't expecting this at all. And then the police revealed that they'd found his DNA on an exhibit from that crime. And the odds of it being another person other than him were 1 in 1 billion, at which point a police officer had to hold up the waste paper basket because he was violently sick. He realised that the game was up.
Mulcahy's trial was set for October 2000, and the prosecution had a surprise witness lined up. John Duffy was ready to testify against his former friend. He had admitted to detectives that the pair had killed all 3 women, including Anne Locke.
Duffy couldn't be retried for the murder of Anne Locke because at that time there was still in force something called the double jeopardy rule, which means you can't be tried for the same crime twice. It was a silly law which is now gone, but Duffy said himself at the time, if I could be tried again for this one, I would be. So there was never any point where he was trying to minimise his involvement.
After it seemed like he was going to get away with murder, the gathered press were excited to finally see Mulcahy on trial. Paul Cheston was in the courtroom throughout.
The Mulcahy trial was unquestionably the trial of the year at the Old Bailey. There was huge anticipation at reopening this historic case dating back almost 15 years. And as always, when the case opens and the defendant is brought in, everyone's eyes just immediately shift straight to the dock. You look more like a bank manager than a serial killer. And he immediately set about giving an air of relaxed, as if this was just a formality that would be thrown out of court straight away.
On November the 6th, 2000, John Duffy entered the courtroom to give evidence against his former friend and accomplice.
There was huge anticipation, a real frisson in court when John Duffy shuffled in through the judge's entrance, not through the main entrance, because he was a Category A prisoner, the first Category A prisoner, serving life murderer, to give evidence for the Crown at the Old Bailey. And when he entered court, he shuffled. He had his head down. He would mumble. The piercing eyes were hooded. He didn't want to look up.
The tension in the courtroom between the 2 killers was palpable. Duffy avoided eye contact with Mulcahy.
It was almost as if he considered this was an act of betrayal and he couldn't look in that direction. He didn't want to catch Mulcahy's eye. Meanwhile, Mulcahy in the dock was acting as if he'd never met him and this was some complete stranger. And he was scribbling notes and this and that, and there seemed bizarre that what was a unique and wicked bond for decades, these were so poles apart now across the courtroom.
True to his word, Duffy gave a detailed account of the duo's career of rape and murder.
His accounts, particularly of Alison Day pleading for mercy, with Mulcahy claiming we're going to have to kill her because she's seen us, and Alison Day saying, I've only seen the moustache, don't do this to me, don't hurt me, I won't tell anybody. And Mulcahy, in Duffy's words, twisting the tourniquet and throttling her to death. that for the first and only time, John Duffy showed a glimmer of remorse. His eyes welled up, his voice faltered. The judge called a halt. He was led away. The case was adjourned for 10-15 minutes.
Duffy gave testimony across 2 weeks of the 5-month murder trial. On February the 2nd, 2001, the jury had made a decision on the fate of David Mulai.
And when the jury foreman was asked to go through on each count on this long indictment and answered the first verdict, you find Mulai guilty or not guilty, answered guilty, there was such an escape of emotion and like steam from a kettle of relief. And then it went through the indictment, guilty, 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 guilty.
And when it came to the verdict on Anne Locke, because this had been a case that Duffy had been found not guilty of because of the lack of evidence, this was finally the chance to really lay this to rest. And when a guilty came in on that as well, the atmosphere was extraordinary in that court.
And there was a lot of victims, families in court, an inevitable outbreak of relief, of tears. Mulai himself seemed entirely unmoved. It's almost as if he expected it. And it was an extraordinary scene at the Old Bailey, even by the Old Bailey standards.
And David Mulai had nothing else, no other way of hurting those victims anymore. So as he walked out of the dock, he looked over at 2 of the victims sitting in the public gallery and smirked at them. It was his last desperate act of revenge. And then that was it. And then he was promptly sentenced to a total of 258 years in prison. So I think we can safely say he's never going to get out.
Sentencing Judge Michael Hyam told Mulai these were acts of desolating wickedness. You descended to the depths of depravity.
Finally, 15 years after the murder of Anne Locke, John Duffy and David Mulai were both behind bars. 12 years were added to Duffy's sentence, while Mulai has still never confessed to any of the crimes.
I think the fact that Mulai has always maintained his innocence really is testament to his narcissism. He is protecting the image of himself that he's putting out there to other people. He doesn't want others to believe that he is this individual who's carried out these heinous crimes.
There's always been speculation that Duffy and Mulai were guilty of other rapes, some of which will not even have been reported. But thank goodness, at least finally, they were brought to justice.
These were perhaps crimes that they may not have committed had they never met, but they come together and you create the perfect storm.
For 4 years, John Duffy and David Mulai targeted vulnerable women in and around London. They callously raped over 20 and murdered 3. One of them a 15-year-old schoolgirl. Although initially detained in 1986, it wasn't until Duffy broke the bond that he and Mulai had shared since their childhood that their world of lies fell apart and justice was finally served upon the twisted pair known as the Railway Killers. On December the 8th, 1982, Polish farmer Paweł Tuchlin snuck up on a 24-year-old woman walking home alone. He pulled out a hammer and hit her in the back of the head, again and again.
Well, he would attack his victims quite savagely with a hammer, and sometimes he'd completely obliterate their face.
Tuchlin dragged the semi-conscious woman behind a wall so he could hide his devious actions.
The residents heard the voice of a girl, some moans coming from the bushes.
The woman's cries for help went unheeded, and she died from the blows. In all, Tuchlin sexually assaulted and battered 9 women to death with a hammer, and he seriously injured 11 more. The police called him the Scorpion.
At the end, the prosecutor asked him what he would do if he was released. And Paweł replied, "Well, I'd probably go for another hunt."
Tuchlin's reign of terror across Poland would span 8 years until he was caught in 1983. He then confessed to 9 brutal murders and to the attempted murder and sexual assault of 11 more women, making Paweł Tuchlin one of the world's most evil killers. Gdansk in the north of Poland. Between 1975 and 1983, serial killer Pavel Tuchlin, armed with a hammer, viciously attacked 20 women in and around the busy port city. 9 of the women were callously killed. All were sexually assaulted in what were harrowing times for the people of Gdansk.
It would have been really terrifying being a woman in this area of Poland at this particular point in time. There have been all these hammer attacks on women, 9 were killed, and this is going on for years, and all the time women have still got to go out to work, shop for groceries, they've still got to be in and around public spaces where they might be at risk.
Investigative journalist Krzysztof Wojcik followed the case.
When all this happened, there was a psychosis of fear here on the coast. Women were afraid of going out in the evenings. If they had to go out, or when they finished working in the evening, men were asked to join them, to protect them.
Making matters worse, these were politically troubled times in Poland. A revolution was brewing, and for the government and their communist police force or militia, catching a killer was a low priority. Andrzej Gawrysz was a detective with the unit in Gdansk that eventually caught Tuchlin.
This was not the greatest time in the history of Poland. The authorities weren't too bothered to reveal that a criminal was prowling in our area.
The preoccupation with political dissidents allowed Tuchlin free rein for 8 years. In that time, he sexually assaulted and murdered 9 women and attacked another 11 who survived.
I think Tuchlin got used to getting away with it. There was something in him. He was a loner, he was an ordinary man who seemed to be able to get away with attacking women almost at will because he was quite careful. He chose isolated spots, rural communities, where there was no one to see him.
This killer's story begins some 70 years ago. Pavel Tuchlin was born on the 28th of April 1946 in the village of Góra, some 40 miles from Gdansk. There were 11 children in the family. Pavel Tuchlin was the 8th.
Tuchlin is born in a rural community in Poland, fairly isolated. The parents, Bernard and Monica, are farmers, and it's a fairly disciplined household. The father is violent, often drunk.
As a child, Tuchlin would wet the bed.
There were times when his father beat him for wetting the bed. This problem was never taken care of.
Violence filled Tuchlin's childhood.
His parents were farmers. There was quite a lot of violence in the household. Violence was part and parcel of everyday life. Growing up, he's learning that violence is a way of getting things done, that controlling people, that having authority over them is achieved through being physically harmful towards them.
Tuchlin's bedwetting continued into his teens with devastating consequences.
Pavel wet himself. It led to the problems with making connections with his peers. The kids at school called him a stinker, a firefighter, or a pisser. He was an object of ridicule in the classroom. He wet himself up until he was 18 years old. He was not accepted by his peers, not to mention the girls.
He smells quite strongly of urine. The other kids aren't going to want to hang around with him. They're going to make fun of him. So everywhere he goes, he's isolated, and he's somebody who is increasingly going towards the margins.
Tuchlin had problems forming relationships with women.
He was intimidated by them, probably from a very early age. He found women too frightening to really interconnect with.
As a teen, Tuchlin became a voyeur.
He starts engaging in a behaviour known as scoptophilia, or voyeurism. So he gets pleasure, he gets sexual gratification through watching women through their windows, and this makes him feel quite powerful.
Aged 18, Tuchlin moved from his village to the suburbs of Gdansk and got a job working in construction.
He wants to start afresh in a city where nobody knows him. And he seems to achieve this for at least a short period of time. So he meets a woman, they get married, they have a baby.
It was quickly apparent to his wife, and then probably pretty apparent to him, that this wasn't going to work. The marriage was going to collapse. Indeed it did. It ended in divorce in 1973.
After the separation from his wife, Tuchlin retreated into his own world, one filled with deviant fantasies that would soon turn deadly.
Tuchlin's sexual madness evolved gradually. Then exhibitionism was added. Tuchlin wandered around Gdansk and he just exposed himself in front of girls. He often wore a coat and would get his penis out and flash.
One of the first times that Tuchlin is known to have exposed himself in public was near to the city's medical academy.
He would undress, unzip his jacket. One student saw his penis and, "Hey dude, you have nothing to show," and she started to laugh. In this moment, Tuchlin got pissed off. For sure it upset him. That was a moment when he thought, "Bloody women, I will show you."
He's got these urges, he wants to fulfill them, and the only way that he's going to do that is going to be through force.
Tuchlin decided that to satisfy his urges and avoid rejection, he would have to subdue his next target. He used a hammer and a method he learned as a child on the farm.
He hit the women so they wouldn't move. He stunned them, just as he learnt to do when he lived in the country, when his father stunned the pigs before he killed them.
Tuchlin's first known physical attack came when he was 29 years old. On the 31st of October 1975, Tuchlin spotted 21-year-old Danusha. The waitress was on her way home after work. An investigator who played a key role in the killer's capture, Stanislav Świek, vividly recalls the assault by Tuchlin that night.
He attacks this girl, smashes her with a hammer, and drags her to the bushes. Suddenly, a witness comes along, a woman. She hears the girl whimpering.
He tried to undress her, but he was scared away by the couple that was passing by.
So he says to the woman, "I think someone's groaning over there. Something bad must have happened. You stay here and I'll go call the ambulance." He then calmly walks away.
The woman fortunately survived.
Danusha was really lucky that she was found so quickly. It was the decisive factor for her. The police and ambulance came and they took her to the hospital. She was in critical condition. They managed to save her life. It was only because Tuchlin did not stay with her.
Tuchlin was not caught after his first attack, and more troubling was that his violent fantasy of subduing a woman and sexually molesting her had not been fully satisfied. So 2 months later, in January, armed with a hammer, he struck again.
It's cold, wet, snowing, isolated, and he's literally hunting for prey. The second attack, he hits the woman again on the head with a hammer, and then again is interrupted. So you've got these first two attacks, which are effectively coitus interrupters. The fulfillment hasn't actually happened, and so he's thinking this must be completed.
The woman survived, but was seriously injured by the perverse assault. 4 weeks later, on February the 12th, 1976, Tuchlin attacked again. His third victim managed to get away too, but not before Tuchlin injured and traumatized her. The sexual predator had now developed a modus operandi that was as cruel as it was simple.
His MO was quite basic and quite brutal. So he would go out equipped with a hammer that he would wrap cloth around the top of, not to soften the blow, but to stop his stomach from getting cold when he tucked it down his trousers. His approach with his victims was incredibly direct. Some of them he would walk up to and say, "Have sex with me." And clearly that's not going to be met with a particularly warm reception.
When he was rejected, Tuchlin turned violent.
He liked to chase his victims. He didn't just want to overcome them straight away. He wanted, I guess you'd call it, the thrill of the chase. It would prolong the pleasure for him and obviously the distress for his victim.
Then Tuchlin would attack the woman with a hammer.
Which, in a way, gave him a perfect MO, because that person from that point on would not be any trouble, would not scream, would not draw attention, and they would be exactly what he wanted, a passive, motionless female that he could sexually gratify himself with.
Sometimes he'd completely obliterate their face. That is often a very personal style of killing. It's taking away somebody's identity when you're attacking their face in that way. So he probably felt quite resentful towards his victims.
Subdued, Tuchlin would then sexually assault the women. In his first few attacks, he did not kill his victims. Instead, he left them severely injured and clinging to life. But then, at the end of 1976, Tuchlin's attacks on women in and around Gdansk suddenly ceased. That was because Tuchlin had been arrested for something very different.
His attacking of women comes to a stop because he's been imprisoned from 1976 until 1979. He's in jail for theft from his workplace.
Tuchlin was caught stealing tools and served 3 years. When he was released in the summer of 1979, he got a labouring job. He was in charge of distributing tools at a company that repaired railway rolling stock. With his weapon of choice easily available at the ZNTK factory where he now worked, it was only a matter of time before Tuchlin struck again.
He doesn't start out as a killer, but the inevitable outcome of that desire is that the attacks escalate. And they escalate, obviously, into murder.
He was developing into a bit of a hunter, a bit of a predator. He came to figure out the ways that would be most effective to get what he wanted. So he'd pick locations that were isolated, where there wouldn't be other people around. So if somebody comes along and they're a woman and they're on their own, then they're potentially one of his victims.
On November the 9th, 1979, Tuchlin caught a bus to Leszno, a village about 10 miles outside of Gdansk, where he went out hunting for his next victim.
This was not a situation like before when he just wanted to expose himself or masturbate. With a hammer tucked in his belt, he was actively looking for a victim.
Irena, a 20-year-old nurse, was walking home when she was spotted by Tuchlin.
She was walking alone. He was getting closer and closer to her. He already had his penis exposed. She turned towards him, but he just attacked her with a hammer.
We're talking about 15 hammer blows to the head. Every one of those is going to lacerate the scalp, potentially fracture the skull. By the time you've got through 15 blows, it is going to be quite a horrific sight. There's going to be severe damage.
Once he was sure that Irena had been subdued, Tuchlin dragged her into some nearby bushes.
The girl was still alive. She moved her hands and she tried to bend her legs. These were the unconditioned reflexes after severe damage to her head. Dozens of hammer hits caused the base of her skull to fracture.
Tuchlin then sexually assaulted the woman while she was still alive.
His feelings of power come from making others powerless, and there is no kind of sense of respect for his victims. They are literally just sex dolls for him that just lie there whilst he does what he wants, and he doesn't give a damn whether they live or they die. As long as he gets what he wants at that particular given time, then he's happy.
When Tuchlin was done, he got dressed, wiped the blood off the hammer, and walked away.
He left this woman lying there in the field.
The 20-year-old nurse, Irena, was Tuchlin's first murder victim.
Irena died at 1 or 2 a.m. She was found next morning. There was no chance anybody could save her.
But as Tuchlin fled the scene of the crime, he made a major mistake. As he tried to leap over a stream, he dropped the hammer.
He suddenly stopped, and then the hammer dropped out of his hand and fell into the water.
The police searched the crime scene the next day and soon found the hammer. It was lying in shallow water.
Irena's killing could be a breakthrough moment of the investigation. There was a sign on it, ZNTK, for the rolling stock maintenance and construction factory.
The police interviewed workers at the factory where Tuchlin was in charge of handing out the tools. But because Tuchlin had stolen the hammer he used in the attack, his name was not on the list of people who checked out hammers that week. So Tuchlin slipped through the net, and that would prove costly. In 1980, Paweł Tuchlin moved back to the village of Góra in northern Poland, where he was born. Here, 40 miles from Gdansk, and now living on a farm, the man who had attacked 4 women with a hammer and killed 1 was hiding in plain sight. On the surface, 34-year-old Tuchlin was living an ordinary life. He even remarried and had a second child. But his wife seemed oblivious to his heinous activities.
I think he kept them reasonably well hidden in that he went out, during the night and at times when he might not be missed that easily.
He explained he had some extra jobs. He said that apart from his regular job, he made extra money working for private individuals.
All the while, Tuchlin's deadly desires had not abated and in fact were growing stronger. It would only be a matter of time before he attacked again.
There's always going to be something in the background that is unresolved in him. He's always going to feel that resentment and that bitterness towards people who marginalised him growing up.
One of the problems where someone engages in this kind of attack on females for a sexual purpose is that the repetitive nature becomes a little bit mundane once it's been done a few times. To add excitement, to add more kind of stimulation to it, those attacks became more and more vicious and more often deadly.
On the 1st of February 1980, Tuchlin was once again on the hunt when he spotted 30-year-old Anastasia walking home. With a cloth-bound hammer tucked into his trousers, Tuchlin approached the young woman. When she rejected his advances, he ruthlessly struck. While his victim lay dying, Tuchlin helped himself to all that he wanted.
Tuchlin actually did after he had managed to gratify himself and rummage through the bags and belongings of the victims, he will have taken things, the odd trophy that he could actually use as some kind of reminder of the event itself. But he also almost engaged in a kind of post-sex celebratory meal. He would take any food that was left and he would eat it whilst actually watching that female die, bleed, be in agony.
Here's somebody who doesn't care about the suffering or the pain of other people. He'll take the lunch of one of his victims and he'll sit there eating it while she's fighting for her life, because it's all about him and his own survival and his own needs and his own desires.
Anastasia was Tuchlin's second murder victim. In 5 years, 3 of which were spent in prison, Tuchlin brutally attacked 9 women. By the end of 1980, Tuchlin had killed a total of 6 women and was about to murder many more.
On the map, you can see the spread of the crimes. In the beginning, when Pavel Tuchlin lived with his first wife in Gdansk, he attacked in the suburbs of the city. After 1980, when he moved to Góra, the attacks were there. He moved by bus, by train, or by stolen car.
Dojeżdżał pociągiem albo kradzionym samochodem i kolejne ataki mamy w tych miejscowościach.
And the following attacks in these towns were along the car route.
Samochodowej.
With the communist government preoccupied with the uprising that had begun in September 1980 and led by the labor union known as Solidarność, few resources were allocated to murder investigations. That meant Tuchlin was able to strike with impunity. In all, he would kill 9 women before he could be caught.
It was a big embarrassment for the police to admit that there was a serial killer in the communist country. The serial killers could exist in the USA, in the UK, or in the Rotten West, as Western Europe was called back then. Not in a beautiful communist country like Poland.
But when, on December the 8th, 1982, Tuchlin attacked a woman next to the local Communist Party headquarters, everything changed.
There was a big fog on that day. The temperature in Skarszeva was approximately 0, and the town was surrounded by a fog so thick that there was no visibility.
In what were perfect conditions for the sexual predator, Tuchlin saw 26-year-old Bożena, a local factory worker, walking home alone.
He saw she was petite. Bożena was a slight woman. When he was close, he simply attacked her.
After he hit her in the head with the hammer and knocked her out, Tuchlin dragged her to some nearby bushes where he continued his attack. But Bożena was still alive. Residents in an apartment complex nearby later reported hearing her cries for help.
The residents heard the voice, "Mum, Mummy," the voice of a girl, some moans coming from the bushes. But no one really knew what was going on. Tuchlin started to undress Bożena. In the meantime, she woke up several times, said something, started begging for help. He hit her with a hammer again. After the first hit, Bożena woke up at least twice, as he described it later.
When he was done satisfying himself, Tuchlin left the fatally injured Bożena to die. But this time he made a mistake that would eventually put an end to his serial killing spree. As the murder happened next door to the local Communist Party headquarters, the mass murders could no longer be ignored by the regime.
Bożena died next to the headquarters of the ruling Communist Party. That fact put huge pressure on the authorities.
To dodatkowo spowodowało większe ciśnienie u władz, które
They wanted to solve this case somehow.
wyjaśnić.
In January 1983, a new police task force was set up to find the serial killer. At that point, Tuchlin had attacked 16 women with a hammer. Called Scorpion, the team was so named for the way Tuchlin struck his victims.
It's kind of appropriate, the idea of the sudden striking motion that you're not expecting. You can imagine a scorpion moving like that.
One of the commanders of the special unit was Stanislav Szek.
Our group had the support of the whole police force in the entire area. In fact, the information connected with this case was flooding in from different directions.
After matching murders committed in the same way, the task force quickly worked out they were dealing with one serial killer and sexual predator. A key detective on the Scorpion team was Andrzej Gavrish.
In terms of those first pieces of evidence, we can say that on those specific crime scenes, similar tools seem to be used to attack the victims.
Do zaatakowania ofiar według pracowników, którzy zajmowali się.
People who worked on those cases had a stronger and stronger belief that all these murders were committed by one person.
Jedna osoba wskazywał na to sposób działania sprawcy.
The hunt for the so-called Scorpion killer was now on.
I think he would have been well aware of the coverage of these crimes and the fact that he was branded the Scorpion. Here's somebody who's been marginalised and isolated and excluded their entire lives, and now they're this pseudo-celebrity. Now everybody is talking about them. And I think that would have made him feel quite powerful.
With the task force fully engaged in stopping the Scorpion, the net was closing in on the serial killer. Pavel Tuchlin was living on the family farm in the village of Góra, some 40 miles from Gdansk in Poland. He had so far attacked 16 women and killed 8 using a hammer. But he was about to make a mistake that would lead to his capture. On the 28th of February, Tuchlin stole a van and was driving near the small town of Lubihovo when he spotted some piglets at a local farm.
Tuchlin saw there was some piglets in the pigsty. He drove to the back, loaded the piglets and arrived home unnoticed. He told his wife he got the piglets for a job he did instead of money. He put the piglets into the pigsty, built a fence, spent some time at home and then went hunting again.
Tuchlin's criminality, be it theft, murder or sexual assault, now consumed his life.
He wasn't just a sexual predator, he was a thief. He stole a van, and as he was driving the van, he sees a woman walking along the road, and I think he sees an opportunity there, and he decides, right, well, I want her.
Early the next morning, on March the 1st, Tuchlin had his next victim in his sights. 25-year-old Wiesława was an accountant and was getting ready to go to work at the local state collective farm. When she left her house, Tuchlin followed her in his van. Then, when he was sure no one was around, he sped up.
When Tuchlin saw a woman walking along the side of the road, he sharply pulled over and hit her. She lost consciousness.
Tuchlin put her in the back of the van and drove to some secluded woods nearby.
There, he took a hammer and began striking her. He left her completely annihilated.
And then everything does start to unravel because he's changed his MO. This isn't the usual hammer attack that he uses. And I think at this point in time, he feels like he's pretty invincible. Nobody's caught up with him yet.
But as Tuchlin was trying to drive away, the van got stuck in the mud. Tuchlin then decided to assault the woman. He got her out of the van and viciously attacked her. When he was done, Tuchlin left his victim, Wiesława, to die in the field while he abandoned the van and left for home.
Wiesława was really lucky. She survived despite being hit with a hammer.
Though seriously injured, Wiesława was able to give the police who were called to the scene a description of the man who attacked her. At the same time, the police found pig feces in the back of the abandoned van. With that evidence, they determined the attacker must have been from the country and not the city. But the biggest clue that would lead the Scorpion task force to capture the killer was the fact that he could drive. In the 1980s, being able to drive in Poland was still a rarity. Commander Stanislav Siek himself searched through the records of people in the area with a driver's license.
I remember it like it was yesterday. We requested the records of all people who had a driving license from the areas in which he attacked and murdered people. We asked for people between ages 25 and 40.
Then Stanislav cross-checked a list of people with a driver's license against the records of known criminals.
It was a list of crimes committed by a man named Paweł Tuchlin. There was something about thefts. He stole some things.
When the detective requested a mugshot and compared it to the 8 photo fit sketches given by some of the survivors, Stanislav had his eureka moment.
When I saw it, when I saw what he looked like, it was a dream come true. It was a compilation of all the photo fits we already had from the witness testimonies. Well, this information, joined by the fact he had a license, gave me the shivers.
What is more, from the driver's license records, the investigators found Tuchlin's home address. But before the Scorpion task force could get their man, Tuchlin struck again. On the 6th of May 1983, Jolanta, a 19-year-old seamstress, was on her way home. Tuchlin approached her, and when she refused his crude advances, he hit her with a hammer and then sexually assaulted her. Jolanta died from the awful injuries she'd been subjected to. She was Tuchlin's 9th murder victim. But when Tuchlin succumbed once again to petty theft and stole a large pig cooker from the farm next door, the task force closed in. Once he realized who stole the cooker, Tuchlin's neighbor called the police.
I think at this point in time, he does feel like he can do whatever he likes, that the authorities are never going to catch up with him.
On the 31st of May 1983, 3 weeks after his last murder, the police arrived to finally arrest 37-year-old Paweł Tuchlin.
When we saw Paweł, the 4 of us were sat in the car and we all thought, it must be him, it must be him.
The police approached Tuchlin when they already knew he was a murderer. But the cooker was a pretext to arrest him. They handcuffed him, and you don't do this for such a petty crime.
They took Tuchlin in, and Andrzej led the questioning.
The interrogation lasted around 4.5 hours, but Paweł stayed calm throughout the whole thing. At first, he didn't want to talk. He said he didn't remember. We were asking him about specific places and specific dates. And step by step, Paweł began to reveal the truth.
A leading Polish forensic expert, Adrian Wrocławski, analysed the case.
Following Tuchlin's arrest, and during the search of his property, where a lot of evidence was secured, the officers found his shoes in the cupboard of his electrical workshop.
When they found the murder weapon too, a blood-stained hammer, Tuchlin's fate was sealed.
Once Tuchlin was actually confronted with evidence, he knew the game was up. He knew that he may as well confess. He may as well sort of get it off his chest, if you like, but most of all, probably be able at last to brag about it.
Then, in an extraordinary move, the police took Tuchlin back to the scenes of his crimes and had him reenact the attacks.
He was so excited by these events that during the investigation, he often said he could show more during the reconstructions.
Więcej będziemy w stanie pokazać na wizji lokalnej I prosił nawet, gdzie były praktykantki.
And he even asked, as there were legal apprentices there, to get the younger girls so he could demonstrate it better as they turned him on.
Lepiej by było zagrane.
Not only was he reliving what he'd done, he was also kind of showing off to all these fairly indifferent individuals exactly what he had done. And he was to some degree proud of it, because those were his sexual conquests.
On the 5th of May 1985, Tuchlin's trial for the murder of 9 women began at the provincial courthouse in Gdansk. But even though he'd confessed to it all, in court he pulled a major surprise.
Up until then, he pleaded guilty of the charges, as well as actively taking part in the visits to the crime scenes. But after the reading of his indictment, he pleaded not guilty. He said that he was forced to confess, that there was an agreement between him and the militia officers. If he confessed, he would spend 3 years under observation in a psychiatric unit, but then he would be free to go and enjoy his life.
But the jury did not buy his defense. On August the 6th, 1985, Pavel Tuchlin was found guilty of 9 murders and 11 attempted murders. He was sentenced to death.
The number of victims, the amount of suffering and the endless tears that he caused allow us for sure to consider him one of the world's most evil killers.
On May the 25th, 1987, nearly 12 years after his first attack, Pavel Tuchlin was executed for his crimes.
He was sentenced to death by hanging, and as he was being led to the end, he really was kicking off. He was giving his guards a very hard time of it. And you often see this with killers who are given the death sentence. They have a last vestige of power here. They can control what happens in relation to their death, and he wasn't going to go quietly.
At the end, this was the last shocking thing. The prosecutor asked him what he would do if he was released. Pavel replied, "Well, I'd probably go for another hunt."
We did this. We worked this case for the memory of these girls who were always on my mind.
Thanks to the dedication of the detectives on the case, Tuchlin's 8-year reign of terror in and around Gdansk and northern Poland was finally stopped. But the brutality of the crimes, sexually assaulting and killing 9 women, and the attempted murder of 11 more, makes Pavel Tuchlin one of the world's most evil killers. Seattle, Washington, November the 5th, 2003. The King County Superior Court. In front of a packed room, 54-year-old killer Gary Ridgeway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder.
Gary Ridgeway is probably the most prolific serial killer in America, if not the world.
He was a killing machine, a man of extraordinary evil.
When another body was found years later, the terrible death toll hit 49.
He's preying on sex workers or young women who have run away from home, people who are vulnerable. He disposes of their bodies in the Green River.
Among the many victims were young girls who'd run away from home.
She was a little girl when she was murdered by him.
She deserved the best of everything. She deserved to have a very happy life.
Despite police suspicions, it took nearly 20 painstaking years to gather enough evidence to convict Ridgeway for the murders.
I poked him with my finger in his chest. I says, "You SOB, I know you did it, and we're going to get you."
the man who became known as the Green River Killer murdered 49 young women and is suspected of killing many more. All that makes Gary Ridgway one of the world's most evil killers. Seattle, Washington, 1982. It was here in the Pacific Northwest where arguably the most prolific serial killer of all time, Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer, preyed on vulnerable young women, runaways, and sex workers.
Gary Ridgway gets a special place in the role of serial killers because we're talking about a man who's responsible clearly for killing at least 49 women.
After he's murdered his victims, he disposes of their bodies in the Green River. Victims' bodies are found in the river, they're found weighted down, and he hasn't just raped and killed these women, he has extended his power and control over them. So some are found with objects inserted inside them, stones essentially.
This was a killing machine, operating in plain sight. What could be more horrifying? If you walked out into the street and said, "Good morning, Gary," you would not say for 1 second that Ridgway was a serial killer.
Elaine Porterfield was a young reporter with the Seattle Post-Intelligencer at the time.
He was viewed as largely unremarkable and almost kind of uninteresting, maybe a little bit odd. Gary was a truck painter for a famous truck building company here in Seattle.
With his unassuming persona, Ridgway was able to commit mass murder for nearly 20 years and get away with it. The fear across the Pacific Northwest was palpable.
I think that this case really did have a significant impact on the community. There'd been this serial killer on the loose for many, many years who was named the Green River Killer. And this person didn't have an identity. He was this faceless monster.
Every time a body was found, it was thought that it could be attributed to the Green River Killer, and that included some cases in Oregon and all the way up to British Columbia. And it was terrifying to women going out by themselves.
Virginia Graham's sister, Deborah Estes, was one of Ridgway's victims.
You know, we're both small. She's was about, my same height. And she loved the color purple. That was her favorite color, and she absolutely adored horses. She loved horses.
Deborah disappeared in September 1982.
You cannot begin to, unless you've lived that, you can't begin to understand this specific hell on earth that really is.
Candice Diskin's younger sister went missing in 1987.
My sister's name was Roberta Joseph Hayes. Bobby Joe, that was her nickname. I think of her often. I don't know, she just had a big, beautiful smile and big blue eyes, and she was a funny kid.
Bobby Joe's body was not found for 4 years. All the while, Candice suspected the worst, that her sister had been murdered by the Green River Killer.
It was a really tough time not knowing where so many people's loved ones, their daughters, where they were, what was happening to them.
Sergeant Frank Atchley and his partner Bob Lamoria served jointly as supervisors on the Green River Task Force. They and their fellow detectives worked tirelessly to track down the man who was arguably the most prolific mass murderer in U.S. history.
We were finding victims 2 or 3 times a week during certain periods of time during the investigation.
We had victims that were missing for over 2 years, that had never been reported missing. So it made it easy for Mr. Ridgway to get away with it as long as he did, because we were sometimes 2 and 3 years behind him.
This killer's story begins over 70 years ago. Gary Ridgway was born in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1949.
The middle of three sons, to a ferocious, domineering mother and a bus driver father. His parents argued relentlessly, but he always took his mother's side. The mother was to become the most signal figure in his life.
The other thing about his mother is this. Up till roughly age 13, he had a bedwetting problem, and his mother would deal with his problem by personally washing his genitalia. This kind of behavior is very unusual. It is going to inevitably lead to a confusion about sexuality. And indeed, Ridgway admitted to his psychiatrist that he had lustful sexual feelings towards his mother.
As a teenager, he was obsessed with sex.
By the time he reaches adolescence, Ridgway has got what could only be described as a supercharged sex drive. He wants sex all the time, everywhere, regardless.
Ridgway struggled in school and was held back 2 grades.
There's also problems with his peers. He's always the slow one, he's always a bit behind. So always being the odd one out, not having that sense of belonging. And one of the things that Gary Ridgway learned to protect himself was to be violent, was to instill fear in other people, because that was a kind of armor.
Age 16, Ridgway viciously attacked a 6-year-old boy.
It actually stabs the boy seriously in the liver, and the child survives. This episode hints that there is some completely psychotic, disorganized process going on just below the surface with him.
Ridgway was not identified, so was never charged with the assault. In 1969, he joined the US Navy. The following year, Ridgway married his first wife, but his mother was still ever present in their relationship.
This is a woman who was so dominating that even after he got married, his mother would decide what clothes to buy him and that he should wear.
Soon after getting married, Ridgway was deployed on a tour with the US Navy. Unable to contain his sexual urges, he regularly visited prostitutes.
Wherever he was, he visited sex workers. And in several cases, he contracted venereal diseases, which he was angry about, and which he held against the sex workers. And I think that just fed on itself, that anger, that hatred, that depersonalization of these women.
When Ridgway returned the following year, he found his wife had been dating another man. The couple divorced in January 1972. A year later, in 1973, he found a new wife. While he was married, Ridgway also found a new outlet for his passions.
Ridgway suddenly became something of a religious zealot, a Bible thumper. He would proselytize. He's kind of fervent, almost out of proportion, his interest in religion.
Religion plays a very interesting role for some subset of serial killers. The problem is that religion, psychology, medications, none of them have proven more powerful than the urge to kill in a serial killer.
Ridgway and his new wife had a son. On the surface, they seemed like an ordinary, God-fearing, all-American family.
Part of him was still a sex maniac. Another part of him was very guilty about that. So you have what you might describe as the Jekyll and Hyde character. Dr. Jekyll, a religious, caring, good husband, and you have Mr. Hyde, of course, who is still going to prostitutes regularly.
Visiting prostitutes at night and with his mother ever present in their relationship, Ridgway's second marriage ended in divorce in 1981. Soon after, he had his first run-in with the law when he was arrested in 1982 for soliciting a prostitute. The minor charge would be an ominous sign of the women he would prey on and the monstrous murders that he was about to commit. Driven by an insatiable sex drive, Ridgeway had started to pick up street prostitutes from the SeaTac Strip, the road that connects Seattle to the neighboring city of Tacoma.
This is a highway that was frequented by sex workers at the time.
Ridgeway's first victim was just 16 years old. One night after work, he picked the sex worker up from the strip. Sergeant Frank actually supervised the task force assigned to catch him.
These women were in the area of Pacific Highway South, and that's where he would make contact with them and abduct them, okay? And usually these were after hours, during the hours of darkness. How he would get them into his car is anybody's guess.
Ridgeway took his first victim to a desolate location along the banks of the Green River, just outside Seattle's city limits. The body of the 16-year-old was found on July the 15th, 1982. Detectives later determined that she'd been murdered about a week earlier. Sergeant Bob Lamoria supervised the search at the first crime scene.
The first victim apparently floated down the river and got tangled up in some brush and the rocks, and her body was exposed in plain view.
Her kidnap and killing in July 1982 would set a sinister pattern that would result in 49 confirmed murders. Ridgeway typically targeted young women drawn to the peace and promise of America's Pacific Northwest.
He's preying on vulnerable women, so women who are either sex workers or young women who have run away from home.
They were young women doing the best they could in the way they knew how. They were 15, 16, 17 years old, 20 years old.
After his first murder, Ridgeway went on a frenzied killing spree. In just 5 weeks, he picked up 5 more women from the SeaTac Strip. By August the 15th, 1982, Ridgeway had kidnapped, raped, and callously killed all of them. He dumped one of the bodies near a creek and 4 in the Green River. The defiled bodies were found in clusters along the banks.
The homicides started in, 1982, and the publicity that was being received or broadcasted by the news media, every member of this county, the state of Washington, the United States, were aware of these murders.
In August of 1982, a task force was formed to catch the so-called Green River Killer. The team scoured the area and made a series of grim discoveries.
This was the site of 3 of the victims. There were 2 upstream a ways, pushed into the water and weighted down with rocks. A third one was left on the bank in the tall grass. I assumed that he thought he was going to get caught. He saw somebody and dumped the body and ran because she didn't make it in the water.
When the call came out, we would have dispatched the task force. We would set up a perimeter. We would line up, and we would clip every blade of grass, looking for any hairs, fibers, or anything else that might be of investigative value.
Analyzing the bodies, detectives quickly determined a pattern in the killer's behavior. He would head to the SeaTac Strip after work. There he would pick up a sex worker from the side of the road. The women did not know it, but then their fate was sealed.
His method of operation, his MO, was taking these women to wooded, isolated areas, sometimes along riverbanks, along stretches of road, so that he would see any approaching vehicles, give him plenty of time to avoid being seen.
Ridgeway would park and persuade the women to get out of his truck. Then he would attack.
Each victim was manually strangulated, and The fact that he admitted to the pleasure he sought out of watching the life seep out of each of the bodies, I feel that is horrific.
What is more, Ridgeway's victims had no idea it was coming.
Ridgeway strangled many of his victims from behind. It gives him, first of all, the element of surprise. It reduces the likelihood they can effectively fight back against him. In those few seconds before his victims became unconscious, they would be shocked, they would be struggling to breathe, they would be in pain, they may be trying to fight back. In about 10 seconds, somebody will be unconscious and unable to respond to you.
He started off strangling with his hands, but increasingly they put up a fight. It bruised his arms, and he didn't want to have to explain that to his friends or to his son. And so he started using ligatures, because it meant he didn't have to put his hands on their throat.
By the end of the summer of 1982, Ridgeway had kidnapped, murdered, and then raped 9 young women.
He would pick up sex workers and murder them and then dispose of their bodies in clusters. So there would be dump sites where there were several bodies of his victims.
The next group that we found was on the Starlake Road. He would park on a curve so that he could see in both directions, and then he would carry the bodies out and deposit them.
Ridgeway later confessed to having had sex with the bodies after death, in some cases, long after.
The necrophilia, having sex with a dead person, is extraordinarily rare. And it's one of the pieces of the puzzle that suggests true psychosis. To engage in necrophilia, you have to be completely out of touch with reality.
Ridgeway would often revisit the bodies of his victims multiple times. He would move them, he would have sexual relations with the bodies. It's absolutely ghastly.
Deborah Estes was one of the many runaways that Ridgeway targeted. Virginia Graham was 16, a year and a half older than her sister Deborah, when she disappeared in the summer of 1982.
We were so close in age, but she had shorter blonde hair.
Like many who take to the streets, Deborah ran away from what was an abusive family situation. In Deborah's case, her father was the alleged abuser.
You're literally living with a rattlesnake. That rattlesnake can be calm 1 second and can just absolutely, if you are not hyper-vigilant around watching and you drop your guard for just 1 minute, you can seriously get hurt or even die.
On one fateful night in July of 1982, home life became too much to bear for 14-year-old Deborah.
Probably 2, 3 o'clock, maybe somewhere around there, my mom woke up and noticed that my stepdad, Debbie's biological father, was coming out of my sister's bedroom. And my mom asked him, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm just checking on her like any good father would do. So, and no, he wasn't. He was there for a totally different reason. And she left the next day, early, very early.
For Virginia, it's a moment that she still struggles with.
I would have grabbed her and I would have held on to her. And I don't know what we could have done because she was 14 years old.
Deborah's mother reported her as missing to the Seattle police soon after. On September the 20th, 1982, Deborah was brought to a police station. She'd reported that she'd been raped by a client a week earlier and was there to see photos of the suspect. It turned out that the man who attacked Deborah was another serial rapist that was also active in the area. Just after she talked to law enforcement, a detective dropped her off at the motel that she was living in. Deborah was never seen again. She was just 15 years old.
Well, the same day that she got dropped off by the detective investigating the serial rape cases was the same day that Gary Ridgeway picked her up.
Deborah's desecrated body was found nearly 6 years later. She'd been dumped in the debris of a building site just down the road from where she'd been abducted.
From where he picked her up to where he took her to kill her, she maybe would have lived no more than an hour, hour and a half at the most from the time he picked her up. By the time, you know, they drove and everything took place and he buried her, no more than an hour and a half. So, boy, that's a sobering thought.
By the end of 1982, the death toll wrought by the Green River Killer had reached 11. By dumping the bodies in the river and in the woods, hard evidence was difficult to come by.
If a body is disposed in water, then quite clearly a few things will happen. Evidence can be washed away, trace evidence, DNA, blood stains and blood patterns will be washed away, so it reduces the forensic opportunities. If the body is there for a long time, decomposition will hamper the examination.
Even though they found many bodies during the summer of 1982, the Seattle-based task force had no idea who the perpetrator might be.
Our suspect pool was basically every male over 17 or 18 years old in the entire world. And we didn't know whether he was coming from someplace else, flying in or driving in or what.
With the news of 11 women now murdered and their mutilated bodies found by the banks of the Green River, as well as in the local woods, fear spread across America's Pacific Northwest. A mysterious mass murderer known as the Green River Killer was still on the loose. A truck painter by day and a serial killer by night, 33-year-old Gary Ridgeway was hiding in plain sight and living in a quiet Seattle neighborhood.
The police in the area were struggling because who would suspect Gary Ridgway's inoffensive, talkative, plain, ordinary-looking man? There was no horn, there were no tails, he wasn't wearing a great black cloak. Gary Ridgway was the man next door. You would not have noticed him.
He's your average Joe. He's somebody who fits in. He's somebody who you wouldn't be scared of because he doesn't look like a monster.
The killer was preying on young, vulnerable runaways who worked the streets near the SeaTac airport.
He knows that he's got an easy target group here, so that's going to allow him to get away with it for an awfully long time.
Ridgeway would simply pick young women up from the side of the road as they solicited sexual services.
I don't think any of them would have believed that somebody who looked as inoffensive and as Joe average as Gary Ridgeway would be capable of murder.
After what seemed a lull over the winter when no new bodies were found, in the spring of 1983, Seattle's serial killer struck again. In the evening of April the 30th, Ridgeway drove to the SeaTac Strip where he picked up 18-year-old Marie. Like so many of his victims, she sold sex to survive. She also had a boyfriend who acted as her pimp. When he saw her get in Ridgeway's truck, his gut feeling told him something was not right, so he decided to follow them.
The boyfriend saw her get into the car and he was trying to go to her rescue, but he couldn't because he got stopped at an electrical signal light.
When she didn't return home a few days later, Marie's anxious boyfriend and her father desperately searched the area.
The boyfriend and the girl's father drove around the areas trying to find it, and they were worried about the girl because they were also aware of the Green River murders.
The two men made a remarkable discovery.
While patrolling or while driving around checking the areas for their girlfriend and daughter, they found this truck that matched the description that the boyfriend had seen, and it turned out to be Gary Ridgway's.
Ridgway's distinctive truck sat in the driveway as a detective questioned the 34-year-old car painter at his house. With Marie nowhere to be seen, the officer did not pursue the lead. Marie's badly decomposed body would be found 20 years later. However, Ridgeway would remain on the police's radar. But in the spring of 1983, the killer slipped through the net. Just a few days later, on May the 3rd, he killed again. This time, he radically changed his MO. He attacked 21-year-old Carol Ann, a local waitress and a single mother.
Carol Ann was somebody who wasn't a sex worker. She was somebody who knew Gary Ridgeway, and that the two of them had sex, and afterwards Gary Ridgeway had strangled her. But it wasn't enough for him to just kill her. He engaged in some rather bizarre behaviour with Carol Ann's body. So he put a grocery bag over her head. He left 2 gutted fish on her body. He draped an empty bottle of wine over her torso, and he'd left ground up sausage meat on her hands.
Carol Ann's body was found some 20 miles east of the SeaTac Strip in Maple Valley, Washington.
This woman was different than the other victims. It was maybe the only time or the first time that he killed a non-prostitute. And what do we know about Ridgeway's response to doing this? He did something that I've almost never heard of in a serial killer. He laid beside the body and he cried. And crying is something serial killers don't do. And what I would like to suggest this tells us, what it teaches us, is that even the devil himself has a moment where he sees clearly enough what depravity and evil reeks in his soul to be touched humanly.
By the end of the year, the desecrated bodies of 24 women had been found by shocked passers-by. Many more had been reported missing, and the suspicion was that they too were the victims of the Green River Killer. Body parts were scattered all over the Pacific Northwest.
He's been dumping bodies up and down the Green River, taking some of them to the neighbouring state of Oregon.
The Green River Task Force spent countless hours and days carefully gathering all the fragments of evidence they could from across the Northwest.
The task force investigators were spending a lot of time on bone finds. We would launch the whole entire task force and spend a lot of investigative time only to find out at the end that it was an animal bone.
All the while, the killing of young women continued. By the end of 1984, the toll of victims had reached 42. Sadly, the police were nowhere nearer to stopping the Green River Killer.
Believe me, all of the investigators wanted so much to solve this case and prevent somebody else from being killed.
Frank Atchley was brought in to supervise the Green River Task Force in May of 1984 in the hope of finally solving the case.
These detectives, each and every one of them, put their heart and soul into solving this investigation. For each victim that was found, it impacted the morale of the detectives who were hoping that there would be no more victims of the Green River Killer.
The next year, 1985, Ridgeway met the woman who would become his third wife at a Parents Without Partners meeting.
They seem to have quite an idyllic relationship. She thinks very highly of him. He's somebody who is a kind of pillar of the community. His third wife provided quite a lot of assistance to Gary in terms of looking after his finances and that kind of thing. So things that he wasn't particularly capable of doing himself.
At the same time, the killing spree seemed to slow.
His third wife was later to say, "I think I saved many lives because I loved him." It's a most poignant remark, and one that strikes to the heart. You embrace a serial killer and you save lives. I don't think for a moment she thought he was a serial killer when she married him. But my goodness, I find it heartbreaking.
But Ridgway's urge to kill could not be stopped for long. The man who had now killed 46 women picked up 21-year-old Bobby Jo Hayes in February 1987. Her sister Candice recalls those trying times.
In 1991, her remains were found. So 4 years after she went missing, her remains were found on Highway 410 outside of Seattle in Auburn. So that was terrible for the family, as you can imagine.
Like so many of the young women that Ridgway kidnapped and killed, Bobby Jo sold sex to survive. A single mother of 5, she was known to frequent the SeaTac Strip, Ridgway's hunting ground. Bobby Jo also worked the streets of Portland, 2.5 hours south of Seattle.
I would see her, downtown. I would see her on Aurora Avenue, near where we grew up.
Though they shared the same mother, Candice's sister, Bobby Jo, lived with their father and his new wife.
She wasn't treated very well. There was a lot of drinking involved. So she pretty much ventured out on her own at about age 12, hit the streets. I would see her with her Johns. I would see, and my heart just broke. She deserved the best of everything. She deserved to have a very happy life. And that I'm sorry for not being able to help her more. That's probably all.
When Bobby Jo's remains were finally found, it ended years of torment for Candice and her family.
Not knowing can be just as hard as knowing. It's bittersweet. Nothing good about it, but I no longer have to drive Aurora Avenue looking for my sister, because that's what I did for years. I'd be driving and I was just constantly aware of myself looking for her, hoping to see her with a John, or in somebody's car or something.
By the spring of 1987, the death toll wrought by the Green River Killer had reached 46. When some green carpet fibres were found among the remains of several of the victims, a warrant was issued to search the home and workplace of Gary Ridgway, who was already on the police's radar.
The fibers, as it turned out, showed that some of the victims had been in the same environment before or after they were killed.
1 month after Bobby Jo disappeared, on April the 8th, 1987, the Green River Task Force searched the home of Gary Ridgway. A young couple renting rooms above Ridgway's garage helped with their inquiries.
They showed us photographs that they had taken inside the house that showed that had green tri-local type carpet in there.
Frank Atchley and a team of detectives entered Ridgway's home.
I saw Ridgway at the house, and he was smug, and his mother was there, and she was screaming and hollering that we had the wrong guy, and so on and so forth. That's when I poked him with my finger in his chest. I says, "You SOB, I know you did it, and we're going to get you one of these days."
April the 8th, 1987 was not that day.
We found no remnant or anything of that carpet. It had all been removed, replaced. And even the vacuum cleaner didn't reveal anything that helped us. He had really cleaned up the place.
Detectives also searched Ridgway's job site in Renton, Washington, where he worked as a truck painter.
It was 87. We served search warrants on his place of employment. When we got him back to the precinct, they took a swab of his, had him chew on a piece of gauze, which was ultimately his coup de grace.
It would take 14 more years and a breakthrough in technology, but the saliva-soaked gauze with the killer's DNA sealed in promised to reveal the true identity of the Green River Killer. Seattle, Washington State, 2001. Since 1982, the serial killer had taken at least 48 young lives with impunity. But thanks to groundbreaking advances in forensic technology at the turn of the 21st century, the net was finally closing in on the man next door, 52-year-old Gary Ridgway.
Arguably the most prolific serial killer the United States has ever seen, outranking even Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. He looks inoffensive, but is in fact dreadful, a man of extraordinary evil.
At the Washington State Crime Labs in 2001, Dr. Beverly Himmick took advantage of a new technique in forensic technology.
It takes a breakthrough in DNA technology to finally trap Gary Ridgway, a man who's been getting away with murder for close to 20 years.
Called short tandem repeat or STR DNA testing, the detectives re-examined the saliva that was captured in the gauze they'd asked Ridgway to submit 14 years earlier.
When we started the investigation, DNA was just coming on the scene in the United States. And the thing that we finally got Ridgway on, the DNA, had been submitted 2, 3, 4 times previous for processing, but it kept coming back inconclusive. It wasn't until 2001 we got a positive hit on him.
As they were gathering evidence against him in the autumn of 2001, Gary Ridgway suddenly re-emerged.
Whilst Gary Ridgway might have stopped killing for a period of time, he has not completely turned around his behaviour or his lifestyle. In 2001, he is picked up by a police officer as he is soliciting a sex worker.
He makes the mistake of picking up an undercover police officer whom he mistakes for a prostitute, and that led to his arrest.
Alerted to the incident and concerned that he might kill again, law enforcement decided to act. On November the 30th, 2001, they arrested Gary Ridgway.
It was unbelievable. I think at that point, people didn't believe that he would ever be caught. It was absolutely stunning and gratifying. There was a giant collective sense of relief that a monster was off the street.
The Green River Killer was suspected of killing at least 48 women. The problem was that with the evidence they had, the police could only charge Ridgway with 4 murders, and that was enough to warrant a death penalty. For the prosecution, it was a bargaining chip.
Gary Ridgway's attorney contacted the prosecutor and agreed to waive the death penalty in exchange for a complete confession on all the women that he killed in the King County jurisdiction.
To try and help all the affected families find out what had happened to their loved ones, the deal was made. In 2003, Gary Ridgway confessed to the dozens of murders he had committed. The investigators then contacted the families of the deceased.
That was a day, you know what PTSD is? That's a day that I could feel the emotion because I was at work. And the phone rang and my heart started beating. And they said, you know, we have this person in custody. He has confessed to the murders of so many women. I thought I was gonna faint. It was shocking. I never thought in a million years that I would be getting a phone call like that.
On November the 5th, 2003, Ridgway appeared in front of a packed King County courthouse in downtown Seattle and made his plea.
The first time I saw him, it was disappointing. He was kind of a mouse of a man in the minds of so many in the Pacific Northwest as some sort of superhuman, that it was just shocking to see what a little worm of a man he actually was. He tried to apologize at one point, but the father of one of the victims interrupted him with sort of a torrent of emotion, and Ridgway was unable to speak. The father obviously just had to address him. Eventually, he was gavel to order by the judge. But it was a very intense moment.
The only time Gary Ridgway was affected by any words that anyone spoke were when he was forgiven. Interestingly enough, that made me more angry when I saw that. It's like, I just poured my heart out to you, what you've done to our family by taking my sister, and nothing. He had no facial expression whatsoever. I didn't get it.
The first time that they sentenced Gary Ridgway in 2003, I couldn't cry. I was dumb. There just was nothing there.
Virginia Graham went to the court to try to understand why Ridgway had killed her sister Deborah over 20 years earlier.
I don't know how another human being could do to somebody else what he put these girls through.
In the court that day, there were no pictures of who these victims were. It was just names on a piece of paper. So I wanted him to know that she wasn't a thing, that she was my sister and that she was loved. So I had that picture that I showed to him. She was a little girl when she was murdered by him.
In November 2003, Gary Ridgway was convicted of 48 counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to 48 consecutive life terms in prison. When a 49th body was found in December 2010, dumped in Washington, Ridgway was given an additional life sentence.
They found Becky's body. Her remains were found by accident. That was my sister's best friend.
There are so many names, so many victims, and I think it's important that we try and remember all of those women.
In his final statement and admission of guilt, he said, "I wanted to kill as many women I thought were prostitutes as I possibly could." If anyone truly deserves the title of an evil killer, it is unquestionably Gary Ridgway.
The Green River Killer murdered 49 young women. They may be gone, but for the loved ones left behind, they will never be forgotten.
I can always see her face. She was very fun, very bright, big, beautiful, blonde hair, blue-eyed, angelic little girl.
Sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the Green River Killer will never be free again. Arguably the most prolific serial killer ever known, Gary Ridgway is without doubt one of the world's most evil killers.